Most Americans have never heard of this war, but it happened, and it changed everything. The year was 1918. The world was already burning. The Great War had torn Europe apart for 4 long years. Millions of men had died in the mud and the cold. Governments had fallen. Empires had crumbled. And now, something new and terrifying was rising in the East. Something that no one in Washington fully understood. Something that no one was ready for. Russia was on fire, not the fire of bombs or guns alone. The fire of revolution. The fire of ideas. For centuries, the Russian people had lived under the rule of the Tsar. They had worked the land without owning it. They had fought wars without choosing them. They had suffered without a voice. And then, in 1917, they rose up. They pulled the Tsar from his throne. They burned the old world down. And in the ashes, a new group took power. A group with a radical idea. An idea that said the workers should own everything. That there should be no kings, no rich men, no private property. That the world should be shared equally by all people. They called themselves the Bolsheviks. And the world did not know what to do with them. The leaders in London and Paris and Washington watched with fear. They had spent 4 years fighting a world war. They had lost a generation of young men. And now, right in the middle of that war, Russia had pulled out of the fight. The new Bolshevik government had signed a peace deal with Germany. They had walked away from the alliance. They had left the Western powers alone to face the German army. That was the first betrayal, or so the Western leaders believed. And they were angry, and they were afraid. But the fear went deeper than the war. The leaders of the Western world were afraid of the idea itself, the Bolshevik idea, the idea that workers should rise up and take power from the rich. That idea was dangerous, not just in Russia. Everywhere, workers in France were restless. Workers in Britain were organizing. Workers in America were striking. If the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded in Russia, would it spread? Would it cross the borders? Would it reach Paris? Would it reach London? Would it reach New York? That question kept powerful men awake at night. And so, quietly, almost secretly, the Western powers began to make a plan. They would not let the Bolsheviks win. They would send soldiers into Russia, not to conquer it, not officially, but to help the forces fighting against the Bolsheviks. There were many Russians who hated the revolution, former generals, landowners, people who had lost everything when the old world fell. These people were forming armies of their own. They were called the White Army, and the Western powers decided to help them. America joined this plan, and almost no one at home knew it was happening. President Woodrow Wilson was a careful man. He had won the war with speeches about democracy and peace. He had talked about the rights of nations to choose their own governments. He did not want to look like an aggressor. He did not want to look like an empire. But he also did not want the Bolsheviks to win. And so he made a quiet decision. He sent American soldiers to Russia, not as an army of conquest, not with a declaration of war. Just quietly, without a vote in Congress, without a national debate, without the knowledge of most American citizens. The soldiers who received those orders must have been confused. They had been fighting in France. They had been trained to fight Germans. Now, they were told they were going to Russia, to a country that was not the enemy, to a war that had no clear name, to a mission that no one could fully explain. 2 separate groups of American soldiers went to Russia. One group landed in the far north, in a frozen port city called Archangel. The other group landed in the far east, in a Pacific port city called Vladivostok. These 2 places were thousands of miles apart. The soldiers in the north would never see the soldiers in the east. They were fighting in the same country, for the same unclear reason, but in completely different worlds. The north was a place of ice and silence. Archangel sat at the edge of the White Sea, where the water froze for months every year and the sun barely rose in winter. The forests there were deep and dark and endless. The roads were poor. The cold was not just cold. It was a living thing. It crept under coats and into bones. It turned mud into stone and breath into clouds. It killed men who were not careful. It killed men who were careful too. The American soldiers who arrived in Archangel in the summer of 1918 were part of a larger Allied force. British soldiers had been there first. French soldiers came too. Together, they were called the Allied Intervention Force. Their stated purpose was confusing even to themselves. Officially, they were there to guard Allied supplies that had been sent to Russia during the war. Officially, they were there to prevent those supplies from falling into German hands. But the real purpose was different. The real purpose was to support the White Army, to push back the Bolsheviks, to keep the revolution from winning. The Bolshevik forces in the north were called the Red Army, and they were everywhere in the forests. The American soldiers quickly found that this was not like the war in France. In France, the front lines were clear. You knew where the enemy was. You dug trenches, and you held your ground. In Russia, there were no clear lines. The enemy moved through the trees like shadows. They attacked in the dark and disappeared before morning. They knew the land. They knew the cold. They knew how to survive in a world that the American soldiers had never imagined. The first winter was brutal. The soldiers lived in small wooden villages deep in the forest. The temperature dropped to levels that froze the moisture in the air. Men lost fingers to frostbite. Horses died in the cold. Supply lines froze. Food was scarce. And the Bolshevik forces kept attacking, hitting hard and then pulling back, always moving, always watching, never giving the Allied soldiers a clean battle they could win. The American soldiers were called the Polar Bear Expedition. That name would stay with them forever. It became their identity. The men who went to the frozen end of the world for a war that America never officially declared. They fought in small groups along the rivers and through the forests. They held a long front that stretched for hundreds of miles. They lived in villages with names they could not pronounce. They fought next to British and French and Russian soldiers who barely spoke their language. And every day, they asked the same quiet question. What are we doing here? Why are we here? When do we go home? There were moments of real and terrible violence. The Bolshevik forces were not small or weak. They were motivated. They believed in their cause. They were fighting for their revolution, for their country, for the idea that had given their lives new meaning. They hit the Allied positions hard. There were ambushes in the forest that left American soldiers dead in the snow. There were artillery attacks that destroyed whole positions. There were moments when the front almost broke, and there were moments of a different kind of violence, a quiet, creeping violence. The violence of not knowing why you were there. The violence of watching your friends die for a mission that had no clear purpose. The violence of letters from home that asked questions you could not answer. The violence of a government that had sent you somewhere it had never explained. Back in Washington, the debate was growing louder. Some voices in Congress were asking questions. Why were American soldiers in Russia? What was the legal authority? What was the plan? What was the exit? Wilson's administration gave vague answers. They talked about protecting supplies. They talked about supporting stability. They talked about Allied obligations. But the real answers were complicated and uncomfortable, and they were never fully given. The American public knew almost nothing. The war in France had ended in November 1918. The Great War was over. The newspapers were full of celebrations, of parades and homecomings, of peace treaties and new beginnings. But in the frozen forests of northern Russia, American soldiers were still fighting, still dying, in a war that had no name and no clear end. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in the far east, the situation was different but equally strange. Vladivostok sat at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, where Russia met the sea that also touched Japan and China and Korea. It was a port city, busy and cold, at the end of the long Trans-Siberian Railway that stretched across the entire width of Russia. The American soldiers who arrived there in the summer of 1918 found a city that was already full of foreign troops. Japanese soldiers were there in large numbers, British soldiers, Czech soldiers, French soldiers, and now Americans. The Czech soldiers had a unique story. They were former prisoners of war who had fought for Austria-Hungary against Russia. When Russia collapsed in revolution, they had been freed. And they had a dream. They wanted to go home to Czechoslovakia, which was then fighting for its own independence. The only way home was east, across Siberia, across the Pacific, across America, and then across the Atlantic. They had started that long journey. They had taken control of sections of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And then they had clashed with the Bolsheviks. The Czech soldiers were tough and experienced. They had fought well, and their fight against the Bolsheviks became another reason for the Western powers to intervene. They said they were going to help the Czechs get home. They said they were going to protect the railway. But again, the real purpose was deeper. The real purpose was to fight the revolution. The American soldiers in Siberia were commanded by a general named William Graves. He was a careful man, a rule-following man. He had received his orders directly from President Wilson, and those orders were confusing. They told him to protect the railway. They told him not to interfere in Russian internal affairs. They told him not to take sides in the Civil War. But the Civil War was everywhere around him. Every village, every town, every stretch of railway was a battlefield between the Red Army and the White Army. Not taking sides was almost impossible. Graves tried. He really tried. He followed his orders as closely as he could. He protected the railway. He kept his soldiers from joining the fighting. He refused to hand weapons to the White Army even when the British and Japanese pushed him to do it. He was an honest soldier in a dishonest situation. The Japanese were the real problem in Siberia. They had sent over 70,000 soldiers to eastern Russia, far more than any other foreign power. And their intentions were not about the Bolsheviks or about democracy or about the Czechs going home. Their intentions were about territory. Japan had been watching Russia weaken for years. They saw an opportunity. They wanted a piece of Siberia. They wanted resources. They wanted land. And they were not hiding it well. Graves watched the Japanese with suspicion. He saw what they were doing. He reported it back to Washington. And Washington mostly ignored it. Because the bigger picture was complicated. Japan was an ally. Japan had fought on the Allied side in the Great War. You could not accuse an ally of empire building while you were still celebrating the Allied victory. The Siberian intervention was messy in ways the Archangel intervention was not. In Archangel, the enemy was clear. The Red Army was the enemy. The mission, even if confused, had a direction. In Siberia, the enemy was harder to identify. The White Army forces, they were brutal. They committed terrible acts against civilian populations. They killed people who were not Bolsheviks, simply because they were suspected of sympathy. They stole from villages. They burned homes. They were not the noble freedom fighters that the Allied propaganda described. They were desperate men fighting a brutal civil war in brutal ways. American soldiers in Siberia sometimes found themselves standing between the White Army and civilians. Graves received complaints from villagers who had been attacked not by the Red Army, but by the forces that America was supposedly there to support. He was caught between his orders, his conscience, and the impossible politics of a war that America had never officially declared. Back in America, voices were growing louder. Eugene Debs, the labor leader, had spoken against the intervention before he was imprisoned for opposing the war. Other voices called it an illegal act, a violation of the principles that Wilson himself had preached. The Senate debated. Questions were asked. Wilson defended his decisions, but never gave a complete explanation. He was already sick by then. The strain of the peace negotiations in Paris, the fight over the League of Nations, had broken his health, and the Russian intervention was just one of many fires burning around him. The Red Army was winning. That was the simple truth that all the foreign intervention could not change. The Bolsheviks had something the White Army did not have. Unity. The White Army was not one army. It was many armies, led by different generals with different goals, spread across a country so vast it was almost impossible to coordinate. The Red Army had a single command, a single vision, a leader named Leon Trotsky who was building a modern fighting force out of raw determination and revolutionary energy. And the Russian people, exhausted by years of war and suffering, were making a choice. Not always a happy choice, not always a free choice, but a choice. Many of them chose the revolution over the old world because the old world had given them nothing, because the revolution at least promised something new. The Allied intervention was not helping. In many ways, it was hurting the White Army's cause, because the presence of foreign troops on Russian soil gave the Bolsheviks a powerful argument. They said that the revolution was under attack by foreign powers, by the capitalists of the West who wanted to crush the workers before they could be free. And many Russians believed that, because it was true enough to be believable. Because foreign soldiers were indeed standing on Russian soil, fighting against a revolution, whether or not that was exactly what they had been sent to do. The intervention became a recruiting tool for the Bolsheviks. Every foreign soldier in Russia was proof that the outside world feared the revolution, and that fear made the revolution feel even more important, even more necessary. The Bolsheviks used the intervention in their speeches, in their newspapers, in their posters. Foreign enemies are at our gates, they said. Stand and fight. And people stood. That BY 1919. It was becoming clear that the intervention had failed. The White Army was losing ground. The Red Army was advancing on all fronts. The Allied soldiers were tired and confused and far from home. The political will to continue was fading in London and Paris and Washington. The costs were rising. The benefits were nowhere to be seen. The American soldiers in Archangel began to leave in the summer of 1919. They had been there for almost a year. They had lost over 200 men to combat, and disease and the cold. They had fought in a war that had no name and no victory. They loaded onto ships and sailed away from the ice and the forests and the silence. They left behind the graves of men who had died for something that no president had ever fully explained. The soldiers in Siberia stayed a little longer. The situation there was more complicated. The Japanese were in no hurry to leave. The railway still needed protection, or so the argument went, and the political situation in Washington was still uncertain. But eventually, the decision was made. The American soldiers in Siberia left in 1920. They too came home to a country that had barely noticed they were gone. The White Army collapsed completely by 1920. The Bolsheviks had won the Civil War. Russia became the Soviet Union, and the idea that the Western powers had feared most, the communist idea, had survived, had won, had taken root in the largest country on earth. The men who came home from Russia came home quietly. There were no parades for them, no celebrations, no monuments on the National Mall. They had fought in a war that was not officially a war, in a country that was not officially an enemy, for a purpose that was never officially explained. They were an embarrassing secret in a time when America wanted to celebrate victory and move on. But they remembered. The men of the Polar Bear Expedition formed a Veterans Association. They met every year in Michigan, where many of them had come from. They brought their memories. They brought their photographs. They brought their questions. And they kept asking why. Why were we sent there? What did our friends die for? Why does no one know our story? Those questions never fully receive an answer. The deeper story of the intervention is about something bigger than the men who fought it. It is about the beginning of a long conflict, a conflict that would shape the entire 20th century, the conflict between the American world and the Soviet world, between capitalism and communism, between two visions of how human society should be organized. The intervention of 1918 to 1920 was the first chapter of that conflict, before the Cold War had a name, before the Iron Curtain came down, before the nuclear weapons and the space race and the proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and everywhere else. Before all of that, there were American soldiers in the Russian snow, fighting a revolution they did not understand, for reasons they were never clearly told. And the Soviets remembered. They remembered the intervention for decades. It became part of their national story. Part of the reason they did not trust the West. Part of the reason they believed the capitalist powers wanted to destroy them. The memory of foreign soldiers on Russian soil in 1918 lived in Soviet politics for generations. It was used in speeches and textbooks and propaganda. It was a wound that never fully healed. And so a small, secret, confused military intervention became a seed of distrust, a seed of hostility, a seed that grew slowly over the decades into the Cold War, into the nuclear standoff, into a world divided by fear between two superpowers, into 50 years of proxy wars and secret operations, and the constant threat of a war that could end everything. All of it had a beginning, and one of those beginnings was in the ice of Archangel in the forests of Siberia, where American soldiers fought a war that America pretended not to be fighting. The men who went there were ordinary men, young men from Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, farmers and factory workers and students. Men who had answered the call because their country asked them to. Men who had not chosen this particular mission, but had gone anyway because soldiers go where they are sent. They had done their duty in conditions that were almost impossible, in cold that froze your thoughts as much as your hands, in forests that went on forever, in a war that had no clear beginning and no clean end. They deserved better than to be forgotten. They deserved a story told out loud, a story taught in schools and remembered on memorials, a story that said, yes, this happened, yes, America was there, yes, these men serve, and yes, they matter. History has a way of forgetting the stories that are too complicated, the stories that do not fit neatly into the national narrative of victory and righteousness. The American intervention in Russia is one of those stories, too messy to celebrate, too real to erase completely. So it was left in the silence between the pages of the history books that everyone reads but no one fully studies. But the silence does not make it less true. In the north of Russia, in the forest near Archangel, some of the graves are still there, small markers in the cold earth, names of young men who came from across an ocean and never went back, who died in a place most of their countrymen have never heard of, who fought in a war that their own government struggled to justify. The wind moves through those forests the same way it moved 100 years ago, cold and steady and indifferent. It does not know or care about the politics that sent men there. It only knows the trees and the snow and the long silence. But somewhere in that silence is a story, a real story, an American story, one that starts with fear and ends with questions, one that begins with soldiers boarding ships and ends with a world divided for half a century. One that most Americans have never heard. But now you have.